Under promise and over deliver. That's what they say. Is that really good advice when it comes to spiritual things, or should we just keep to what it is that we have committed? You see, the Torah does speak about us making commitments to Hashem, and do we have to keep to that commitment, or can we embellish it? Now, it might seem like the answer is obvious. It's not so simple. Pasuk Rambam, in this week's parasha, we speak about Karbonis. The Rambam in the laws of Karbonis tells us, if a person pledges that they're going to bring a large or mature animal as a sacrifice, and then they downgrade to a younger, smaller animal, they have not fulfilled their obligation. Whereas, if you pledge to bring a smaller, younger animal, and then you bring a larger, more expensive, older animal, then you have fulfilled your obligation. And he gives examples. For example, let's say that a person says, I'm dedicating an oila burnt offering or a shlomim peace offering that's going to be from a sheep, but instead he brought a ram, or he pledged a calf and he brought an ox, or he pledged a kid and he brought a goat. Yotza, he has fulfilled his obligation because he's brought more, or so you think, more than what he pledged. Now, where does the Rambam get this from? The case of Mishnah points out that the source of the Rambam is B'divrei HaMishnah b'Menachos, a Mishnah in Tractate Menachos that says, everybody agrees that if you make a large pledge and then you downgrade your pledge to the Beis Hamikdash, you have not fulfilled your obligation. But the heavy gadol, let's say that you pledged a smaller, cheaper animal. Now you want to bring a large animal. There's machlokes b'davar. There's a debate. According to the majority view of the sages, well, you went from smaller to bigger, you have fulfilled your obligation. But Rabbi Omer lo yotza, Rabbi says you have not fulfilled your obligation. Not surprisingly, the Rambam paskins halacha, according to the majority view, which is the rabbis, which says if you pledge something smaller and then you upgrade to something larger, good for you. The fact that the Rambam brings those specific examples of younger animals and then older animals, it's because he wants to highlight for us that a person only fulfills their obligation if it is the same species of animals, as the Rambam explains later in the chapter. Now, what needs to be explained is this. How does this work? How can I fulfill my obligation by bringing a ram if the words that I said were that I'm going to bring a sheep? So I said one thing, I'm bringing something else. Whichever particular example it could be. Where we're not told clearly in the Torah, doesn't the Torah tell us clearly whatever comes out of your mouth, you have to honor it, and you have to do as you had promised. So you're not doing as you promised. You promised a keves, you're bringing an ayah. Because your verbal statement and pledge was to bring something younger or smaller, in this case a sheep, you have to fulfill that obligation. That's what you said, that's what you got to do. You have to do what you promised. So now if you're bringing a larger, older, bigger, more expensive animal, you're beautiful, wonderful, but you're not fulfilling what you said you were going to do. How's that possible? We're going to suggest two possibilities about how this should work. Then the Rebbe is going to question both of them. Finding the two possible ways to explain it. Let's look from the perspective of the person making the pledge. Perhaps when he said that he's going to bring the younger animal, that doesn't mean that he intended only specifically to bring the younger, smaller, cheaper animal and not a larger one. But perhaps what he was saying is, I'll bring something that is no less than the small, cheaper version of the animal. The minimum is, I'll bring the younger animal. So that would be a logical reason why, if he now upgrades, he still fulfilled his obligation, because he actually intended that as well. He was saying, I'll bring nothing less than. That's from his perspective. Or, a little bit more abstractly, maybe we're looking at the item, the animal itself. The truth is that when the person said, I want to bring the sheep or the kid, that's what he meant. But there's a rule that supersedes him. Rashi points out that there's a concept that if I have a larger, bigger, greater item, that naturally includes the obligation for a smaller, lesser item. Similar to the principle that we well know that within the quantum of 200 there is the number 100. Therefore, if I now bring a bigger, more expensive, older animal, the ram, instead of the sheep, etc. Nichlol boy cotton. It's as if I included the sheep in that. It's as if I brought the sheep. All I did was I added value to the promise that I made. Vim kain niskayim nidroi, and therefore I fulfilled my obligation. And good for you. Sounds like good explanations. But on closer examination, it doesn't actually work. Why? Because remember, we said the Rambam is based on the Mishnah Menachos. The Mishnah Menachos brings another scenario as well. And as we unpack the comparison between the two scenarios, we'll see that these two explanations actually don't work. Because a person says, I know that I promised that I'm going to bring a mincha offering made out of so many esroinim, which is a measure of flour. But I don't remember how many esroinim I said. So the Rabbanan say, Yavi, Shishim Yisrael, bring 60 Yisraelos, and you're good. Rabbi says, no, you're going to bring a range. Yavi Minochas Shel Yisraelos, Me'echad Vat Shishim, you have to bring a mincha with 1 Yisrael and 1 mincha with 2 Yisraelos, all the way to 60. So the Rabbanan are saying, take the largest amount, and that will capture every possible mincha variation. And the Rabbi is saying, no, you actually have to bring every variation. The Gemara then unpacks what the debate is between Rabbi and the Rabbanan. What's the basis for the debate? The conclusion is, they quote Rav Ashi, who says, the same debate that they have about a person who pledges a younger, cheaper animal and then wants to bring a larger, more expensive animal is the same debate that we have about the person who pledged potentially smaller a mincha and now wants to bring a bigger mincha just to make sure. So Rabbanan, as the Rabbanan said, if a person pledged a kid and now wants to bring a goat, a calf, and wants to bring an ox, great, that's all good. Same logic here. Let's say the guy really pledged to bring 3 esronos as his mincha, now he's bringing 5. Great, so he's taken the large amount, which incorporates the smaller amount. Whereas Rabbi says that doesn't work. But the Gemara doesn't stop there. The Gemara continues. If you're saying the debate between Rabbi and the Rabbanan is about this principle of the bigger incorporating the smaller, they've already had that debate, as we know, with regards to animals. As the Mishnah said, that if a person pledged the small animal and brought the bigger animal, according to the Rabbanan, he's fulfilled his obligation, and according to Rabbi, he has not. Why do I have to have the same argument brought twice? Anytime that the Gemara seems to think that the same argument is brought twice, it will answer and say, both cases were necessary. Had the Gemara only told me the story with a person who's not sure how many portions of flour he wanted to donate as his mincha, I'd say, okay, well, that's why the Rabbanan say the number is actually irrelevant, because ultimately, if you take 10 esronos or 2 esronos, you're still going to only put 1 kmitza of flour onto the mizbech, so we're not so concerned about the amount that you pledged. Right, regardless of the size of your mincha, at the end of the day, only 1 kometz goes onto the mizbech. But in the case of an animal, the larger animal has to have more accompanying elements brought with it. And maybe they would agree with Rabbi that you're not going to enforce on the person that he has to bring the larger amount if he pledged a smaller animal. So maybe they all, the Rabbanan would perhaps agree with Rabbi that, you know what, when the person pledged an animal, he also had in mind how much accessory has to come with the animal, and he didn't intend the large amount, so therefore he's not fulfilling his obligation because he didn't have it in mind. And on the other hand, and if you say that the debate between Rabbi and Rabbanan is only specifically with animal sacrifices, then Rabbi, I'd say that that's where Rabbi says, because because you're going to be bringing more accessories, therefore you could argue the person didn't really intend to do that, and therefore the larger korban does not fulfill his obligation. But maybe in the case of menachos, where it's only 1 kmitza, regardless of how many pieces or portions of flour you bring, maybe Rabbi would agree with Rabbanan. Therefore, you have to bring both arguments. Now, how is that relevant to our conversation? Because the whole basis, according to Rav Ashi, of the debate between, or at least according to the Gemara's assessment of Rav Ashi, between Rabbi and the Rabbanan is, well, maybe bigger animals require more emurin, and the person didn't have that in mind. And we don't then say, well, what's the difference? The larger amount naturally included the smaller amount, so he should be yotza. Therefore, you can't therefore say that the Gemara really believes that the whole pivot of this debate is the question of whether a larger, bigger, more expensive item naturally incorporates a smaller, less mature, cheaper item. Likewise, it's also difficult to argue that the insight the Gemara is giving us over here is that a person has a particular pledge in mind even when he didn't necessarily say it. So therefore the two suggestions that we made to explain how come it is that I said something and now I'm doing something completely different and yet I'm fulfilled my obligation are not good enough explanations. Plus, there's something else that we have to understand. Let's look at both of those perspectives that we said, which is the person said minimum and perhaps I'll bring more, or a larger, bigger thing automatically includes the smaller thing. Right? That the argument was, well, maybe he only gave the minimum requirement of his pledge, or the broader concept that anything large automatically incorporates something smaller. Whichever way you look at it, the logic is, and if I did pledge to do something smaller, I'm allowed to increase. That's the implication, right? Because I gave a minimum, I can have more than that. If meruba includes the mu'at, then I can expand the mu'at to become something bigger. Now, the Rambam's told us a principle, which is that a person who wants to have merit for himself, says the Rambam, should overcome the Yetzer Hara and be very generous. When you bring a korban, bring from the very best version of the species that you're going to bring. So if it's from the sheep family, bring a ram. And he proves it because the Torah tells us that Hevel, remember, his korban was accepted when Cain's was not. Why? Because he brought the best of what he had to offer. And the Torah tells us, always give the fattest, choicest to Hashem. Now that's with all donations. The Rambam there speaks about a shul and tzedakah. But besides that, specifically with korbanos, it says you should bring the best of your flocks as a korban. Let's go back to those two arguments, which are the person pledged a minimum and he could increase it, or the meribah always includes whatever it is that you had in mind for the mu'at. If the principle then is also bring the best, so if I made a minimalistic pledge, it's appropriate. I should increase it. Maybe it's even required that I should increase it. Mitzad kol chelev l'Hashem, because I'm supposed to give the very best to Hashem. And the Rambam does not sound like he's saying that. The language that the Rambam uses is, if you pledged a smaller animal, but now you chose instead to bring a large animal, it's still acceptable. And it doesn't even use language that is used previously, which is the language of the Mishnah. That if a person originally brought a lamb, and then for whatever reason he couldn't bring it as a korban, and instead now wants to upgrade, gesundheit. He doesn't. He says yotzo, which is mashmash in zedin lechatchila, that this is not the ideal way to bring your korban. You said a lamb, stick with your lamb. It's just that now if you change your mind and you decide you're bringing a ram, okay, we'll accept it. Parenthetically, don't get confused, because there is one particular kind of korban where the type of thing you bring as the korban depends on your financial status, which is brought to atone for 4 specific sins. Is it a Sefer HaChinuch? There the Sefer HaChinuch says something very specific. That if a person is poor, and therefore the Torah mandates that they should bring a mincha as their korban olav yered, and instead the person decided to bring a ewe or a goat, she-goat, that's not acceptable. Why not? Because the Eibishter had rachmanos on you, the poor man, and exempt you from this animal. It's inappropriate now to decide that you're going to do more than you could afford because you're going to be smarter than God. That's with a korban olav yered. That has no bearing on our conversation, because we want to argue that in our conversation it is ideal that you upgrade your korban because kol chelev l'Hashem. What's the difference between the two? Kishom medubar over there, it's discussing aleph bekorban shem tzivei hatira olav v'lo mitzad nidrei. Korban olav yered, the Torah mandates that you have to bring that korban. It's not that you chose that you were going to pledge that korban. And that's why the Torah, what the Sefer HaChinuch is saying, makes perfect sense. They mandated a particular korban. Who do you think you are now to make it fancier? Second of all, also there, the difference between bringing the more expensive for the wealthy person or the cheaper for the poor person korban, it's not just what type of the species of animal it is. It's It's either an animal or a bird or just a little bit of flour. Completely different categories. Whereas we're talking over here about a person who made a pledge. And now the question is, you pledged X, who gives you the rights to expand or to change what you promised? And bearing in mind that the animal you're going to change to will belong to the same species as the animal that you pledged. So those are different concepts to the concept of common Ola V'Yored. And so we're back to square one. How is it that a person could say, I'm making a verbal pledge, which is the basis for bringing a korban, and now I'm changing it, and that's acceptable? And again, why is the Rambam saying it's acceptable? Why isn't he saying it's encouraged? Because kol chelev l'Hashem. Move on. It implies, from the way that the Rambam says it, that the person who said, I want to bring a smaller, lesser animal, did not actually have in mind, or maybe I'll upgrade. And also the fact that the Rambam says yotza, that it's a b'di'evet, means it's not automatic that a larger, better version automatically includes the smaller, lesser version. And it's very obvious what the distinction is between using the expression yesh b'meruba mu'at, that something more includes something less. That's totally different to saying 200 includes 100 for very logical reasons. Because it's a factual, objective reality that 200 includes 100. That's the fact. If you have 200 coins, that means you obviously have within that 100 coins. But when a person now chooses to bring an ox as their korban, there's no little calf inside that ox that you could say, yesh b'meruba mu'at. So therefore, we're back to square one. On what basis does the Rambam paskin that if I made a pledge to bring a smaller animal, it's acceptable for me to bring a larger animal? So to understand that, we're going to look at language that the Rambam uses in introducing this whole concept of verbal pledges. And in fact, the way that the Torah speaks about it, which you might have just read as one run-along sentence, but it's actually telling us two different phrases with two different meanings. Back to my Rambam. So we're going to see what the Rambam says in his heading introduction to the laws of pledges. What is the mitzvah of a pledge? That a person should keep the words they verbalized, and do as they pledged. Now, isn't that superfluous? And actually, you're not saying the same thing in two ways. By the way, at the beginning of the Rambam, when he just lists the mitzvahs, he just says one thing because he wants to be succinct. That every person has a mitzvah to keep what they say. That's because at that part of the Rambam, he's being as concise and precise as possible. Now, you'll say, well, the reason the Rambam's speaking that way is because he's paraphrasing the pasuk. The pasuk says, now we're going to pause a little differently to how you normally read the pasuk. You should keep what comes out of your mouth and do whatever it is that you promised. It's typical for the Rambam in his Sefer Yad HaChazaka to use language that is psukim language. Still, it is a bit of a stretch that in the Rambam's magnum opus of halacha, he would just say something for linguistic, poetic license, unless it had some kind of halachic bearing. And we're going to find that halachic bearing right now. Therefore, it's logical to say, it's not that the Rambam's just simply saying the same thing in two different ways. He's identifying that there are two laws and therefore two levels of obligation about verbal commitments. Aleph, the first is, you have to keep your word. As the pasuk said. Beis, there's an additional independent obligation, which is do what you promised. That's in the words of Vasisa Kashenadarta. What does that mean? What's the difference between keeping your word and keeping your promise? Because when you analyze it, every promise, every pledge is actually comprised of two elements. Number one, aleph dibur piv, what you actually said. The words that came out of your mouth. Then beis toichen hadibur. There's the content that those words were meant to convey, and that's haneda, the actual pledge itself. These are the two elements of the pasuk. God, what comes out of your mouth, that's stick with the message that you said. And do what you promised. That's kiyum toichen nidroi. That means keep the content of what those words were meant to convey. Now we need to split it apart and understand what that difference is. So this will help us appreciate the difference of opinion between Rabbi and the Rabbanan about the person who made a pledge about a smaller, cheaper animal, and now is going to be bringing a more expensive animal. Does he fulfill his obligation or not? That's going to boil down to how we understand this principle of keep your promise. According to Rabbi, the first part of the pasuk is what's koveya. You have to listen to what the person said. The content of your oath is completely defined by the words you chose to use. Therefore, if you said keves, it's a keves, and you can't change it. Whereas the Rabbanan hold, the most important thing is, are you fulfilling the content of your vow? Even if it doesn't match perfectly with the words that you chose. Which means the Rabbanan say that being word perfect in what you pledged, not that important. And by the way, this is not unique to this particular case. This is Rabbi and Rabbanan and how they view many things in halacha. You found multiple times in the Gemara when Rabbi and the Rabbanan debate about language used either in the Torah or by our sages, or even the language used by regular people. Rabbi always says, take words literally and to every detail that those words convey. Dvarim kichsavan. Read it literally. Whereas the Rabbanan say, words can sometimes be a little bit more elastic. As long as the words, as long as what you're doing keeps to the theme of what your words conveyed, you're good. The Rebbe explains this in a different sikha. So now here's our scenario. Person pledged something smaller, and now he's bringing bigger. So he said he wants to bring a lamb, and now he's bringing a ram. So if I'm looking from Rebbe's perspective, where the emphasis is on the words that came out of your mouth, he said, I want to bring a lamb. That word does not incorporate a ram. Whereas if I'm looking through the lens of the Rabbanan, and what's the thrust of what the person wants to achieve? That he's pledging to the Eibishter. And once you're pledging to the Eibishter, we enact the requirement that you should be giving the very best. So we know that it's something from that species of the sheep family that is the best version you could bring. The fact that he chose to say keves, that may be because of some circumstance. Maybe at the time he couldn't afford more than a keves. But really what he wanted to convey is, I'm bringing a korban out of that species of animals. If I'm going with Rabbi's opinion, which is, listen to the words that he said, so if you change from the word he said and you bring even a bigger, better animal, you're not yotza because it wasn't the words that he said. Cotton, his pledge was to bring a small animal. So yes, it's beautiful and it's better and it's more expensive, etc. It's not what he said. He's not fulfilled his obligation. Whereas according to the Rabbanan, we say, let's not get caught up in the words. What was his message? What was his intent? Because the Torah says, do what you promised. Even though we're not going to pressure the individual that, listen, you said a lamb, but really you should bring a ram because because the Torah did say that you can and you should keep your word. Therefore, ideally, first case scenario, bring what you said you were going to bring, the keves. But let's say the person changed his mind and he felt a little bit guilty. Oh, he got a windfall and now he can afford it. And he's bringing the ayil. Then we're going to say, fine, that's good. You're still fulfilling the content of your promise. And therefore you're fulfilling the requirement of the Torah. Because the fact that it has to match your words, not something that's going to break the back of your pledge. We're going to take the Rambam's psak, which aligns with the Rabbanan, even one step deeper. let's say that a person has a positive mitzvah that he wants to fulfill. There's this concept called a neder. One of the mitzvahs that you should fulfill is a neder, and there are two types. Nidrei Isser, where a person says, I promise I'm not going to do X, or a neder, which is I pledge something to the Beis Hamikdash. So when the Rambam discusses that, he again brings two psukim, exactly what we've just said. The one pasuk is fulfill what your word said, and the other pasuk is whatever comes out of your mouth you should do. What's the difference between these two psukim? When it says what comes out of your word, out of your mouth, you should do what you said, that is talking about when you're dedicating something to be holy, like a korban. Whereas the more generic statement, whatever comes out of your mouth, you should do, that applies also to a person promising they're not going to eat this, go there, do that. You can see this in the Rambam's words. When he lists the 613 mitzvahs in his introduction to the Sefer Hadyad HaChazaka, when he quotes that pasuk that says, that whatever comes out of your mouth you should do, he says that's about making pledges. He doesn't say anything about curtailing behavior based on a promise. Now that makes perfect sense based on what we've learned. Based on how we've explained it, we get the difference over here. If you're talking about a person saying, I promise I'm not going to eat X, okay, do what you said. Whereas when a person says, I'm making a pledge, we say, there's two parts to a pledge. The way that you say it, and which tishmo you have to keep, and you've got to fulfill the content of that pledge, even if it's not identical to the very words that you chose. So let's understand what fundamentally is the difference between the type of promise where a person limits themselves versus the type of promise where they pledge something to holiness. Well, let's say that I say I'm not going to eat something. It's me who makes that item now forbidden to me. Without me saying anything, there's absolutely no reason in the world why I shouldn't eat that item, do that thing. Therefore, there's only one law, which is do what you said. Okay, you said you're not going to eat that, you're not going to go there, do that. Fine, keep it. Because you're the one creating this limitation. Honor it. But when a person makes a promise that they're going to bring a korban, etc., then my pledge only makes an existing Torah law applicable. The Torah says that people who pledge korbanos have to bring X and Y. My pledge is applying that law to me. I'm now obligating myself to bring the korban, give tzedakah, etc. As the Rabbi elsewhere explains why the Rambam at the end of the laws of vows tells us, any person who makes a neder, not such a positive thing. It's like building a bomber, which is not so positive. And if a person did make such a neder, best that you get somebody to nullify it. So you don't create an obstacle for yourself. I'm not going to eat X, and then perhaps you do. Says the Rambam, but where is that? The Nidrei Isur. If a person swore or promised that they're not going to do something, or they're going to consider something forbidden for themselves. But if a person pledges to do something positive, then it's a mitzvah to fulfill it. Don't go and ask somebody to nullify it for you, unless there's extreme pressure. As the pasuk says, if I make a promise to Hashem, I have to keep it. That means if a person says, I'm pledging tzedakah, I'm pledging a korban, those are mitzvahs. Therefore, it's not just my power that is imposed on me, the Torah's power now comes into play. The power of bringing a korban, giving tzedakah, etc. It's not just now a personal obligation. I've actually transformed this money into tzedakah, this animal into a korban, and therefore I don't necessarily have the right to scale it back. That's why when it comes to a verbal pledge to bring a korban or do something which is really positive, we're going to kick in what the Rabbanan said, which is you have to do what you said. We're not going to rely just on your words. It's your toichen, it's your intention that gets bound into this particular promise. Even if it doesn't match exactly the words that you said that you were going to do. Now, all of this has a deep spiritual meaning as well. That deep meaning is, Yodua, Shekorban, Umilashon, Kiruv. We know very well that the word korban is from the word to draw close. Adam ki yakriv, a person brings themselves close to Hashem. Technina karbonosu, Adam ki yakriv, tzarech liyos mekem, korban lavaya, as the Alter Rebbe explains, when a person wants to draw close, they have to take something of themselves and use that as a catalyst to bring themselves close to Hashem. His karvusoy shel Yehudi ala Kadosh Baruch Hu. Korban represents a Jew drawing close to Hashem. How? By bringing his talents, his abilities towards the Eibishter, and sometimes sacrificing some of those talents and abilities for the Eibishter. That's the difference between the karbonis and a regular mitzvah, which is a mitzvah is considered like a limb or a sinew of the divine relationship. The 248 positive mitzvahs, which correspond to the 248 limbs of the body, and 365 negative mitzvahs that correspond to the sinews. But they call mitzvah, and therefore via every mitzvah, which is mitzvah, every mitzvah means coming together and teaming up. That is a point of connection between a specific part of myself and the Eibishter. Give tzedakah with my hand, there's a link between my hand and the Eibishter. Whereas the whole idea of a korban is says like you take the animal and you burn it on the mizbeach. A korban means I'm completely throwing myself at the Eibishter. I'm completely dedicating to the Eibishter, right, top to toe. And this fits beautifully with the Ramban's explanation about how it is that sacrificing an animal can atone, because he says, as the person's going through the sacrificial process, they should be meditating that I sinned against the Eibishter physically and spiritually, and I am the one who deserves to chas v'sholem be in the position of this animal. Were it not for the Eibishter's kindness that he allows me to substitute an animal on my behalf. That I should think that blood is in place of my blood, that soul is in place of mine. In other words, the Ramban is telling us a korban is a representation and a replacement of me. Because the theme of a korban is total dedication to Hashem, total sacrifice to Hashem. So it's more than that. We know that karbonos generally represent teshuva, which is actually expressed in what the Ramban also told us. Teshuva is not one of the 613 mitzvahs. It is a catch-all. It is an incorporator of all of the mitzvahs. I say that's why teshuva can fill in all the gaps of an avera, of missing mitzvahs, and repair averas. Which, by the way, is why when the Torah is going to start speaking about karbonis, it does not talk about obligatory, but rather about donated karbonis. Why? As Rashi tells us right at the beginning of our parasha. But karbonis nedavar dibra ha'inyan, that is telling us first the Torah is going to speak about us pledging karbonis. Only after the Torah will get into the details of the obligatory karbonis. Why? Because what's the theme of a korban? Me coming close to the Eibishter. But I don't see me coming close to the Eibishter so clearly if the Eibishter is telling me exactly what to do. Because if those things are obligatory, I see that I'm checking a box, I'm fulfilling an obligation. I don't see that I'm dedicating to Hashem. But when a person says, I want to be generous, I want to pledge, I want to commit to the Eibishter, then you can see I am coming close. And that's the deeper spiritual meaning behind the idea that if a person makes a small pledge and then they expand it, it's acceptable. When a person pledges a korban, which means it doesn't mean I'm doing mitzvah X out of 613, the mitzvah of fulfilling my verbal obligations. What I'm doing here is I'm all in. I'm totally dedicated to the Eibishter. Like the expression Chazal and Rashi quotes this as well, that Chazal use about the poor man who's bringing his mincha, that it says nefesh kisakriv. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says the Eibishter, mi darkal avim mincha oni. Who's the person who typically brings a mincha? The poor man. The Eibishter says, I will consider his simple mincha as if it was his soul brought to me, because that's what a korban is. It's bringing the whole of me, not just a part of me. When the Eibishter says, I consider it as if, there's another meaning to this, a deeper, more powerful meaning, which is, it means that the Eibishter is empowering him. That means that this person is now empowered to do more than they'd be able typically to do. The Eibishter is kind of lifting him up because he's walking up with dedication to Hashem. Therefore, this specific mitzvah of fulfilling my pledge to bring X is expanded into a far greater catch-all mitzvah. The overarching link and bonding between the Eibishter and between us and the Eibishter through korbanos. That's why in this particular area we don't get caught up in the specifics. We want to know the overall feeling that you have. The fact that the person is literally giving their all to Hashem. Which gives us a more profound insight into these words, small and big, in this context. When a person begins their spiritual journey, they are in a spiritually small state. But if the person is starting on a journey of korbanos, which means I want to come closer to Hashem, that automatically links me into something far greater, a far greater movement towards Hashem. Similar to how we explain in Chassidus, that Yirat Atah, the lower entry-level experience of Yira, which is to accept Hashem's authority, leads me into the higher experience of Yira, which is to be overawed by Hashem. Therefore, it's almost a guarantee that you pledge the small, you'll end up bringing the big. You started the journey feeling I'm so limited, and before you know it, you're approaching the Eibishter with greatness. Which means simply that greatness filters through into my experience. I feel it, I see it in the components of my soul. We know that by engaging in learning the laws of the korbanos, we know that it is considered as if we brought the korbanos. And when Talmidei Chachamim are engaged in learning all of the halachas of how you serve the Eibishter in the Beis Hamikdash, it's as if we built the Beis Hamikdash. And the as if will translate into reality, that because we're engaged in this and we care about it and we want to have korbanos in our lives, we want to come close to Hashem, that's actually going to rebuild the Beis Hamikdash with the coming of Mashiach. And then we'll be able to actually physically bring the korbanos, and not only bring korbanos, but as the Eibishter wants them. The Beis Hamikdash that will occur in the third Beis Hamikdash, which should be rebuilt with Mashiach immediately.